Welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani, and a happy Independence Day or week, Nigeria. But this week on the program, though, we've seen Russia conduct referendum in 4 Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine and claim overwhelming victory there. President Vladimir Putin wants those regions annexed as soon as possible. He's done so. He did on Friday. My guest this week will be discussing recent developments in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and whether or not the UN can play its role of preventing the war from going any further. Diplomatic Channel will also bring you highlights of the Nigeria International Economic Partnership Forum held in New York in the United States. We'll be back after a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles.
The United States of America has extended its best wishes and congratulates Nigeria on its 62nd anniversary of her independence. According to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the partnership between the two countries is strong and is built on shared values of democracy, diversity, and a spirit of entrepreneurship. In a statement released on October 1st, Mr. Blinken further adds that the United States is committed to supporting Nigerian efforts to counter terrorism and insecurity, improve health systems, strengthen democratic institutions, promote respect for human rights, and foster economic growth, including through bilateral trade and investment. The head of Lebanon's Hezbollah says that the receipt by the Lebanese authorities of a written offer from the U.S. mediator on the demarcation of the Lebanese maritime border with Israel is a very important step. Sayed Hassan Nasrallah said in a televised speech that the coming days would be crucial for that issue. Meanwhile, Israel has given its preliminary nod to the draft U.S. brokered deal. Prime Minister Yair Lapid told his cabinet at its weekly session that Israeli approval of the draft awaits legal review. Mr. Lapid appeared to float an arrangement whereby gas would be produced by a company under a Lebanese license in the disputed Kana prospect, with Israel receiving a share of revenues.
Nigeria is open for investment was a message at the Nigeria International Economic Partnership Forum in the United States, in New York specifically. A full-day event saw pitches from Nigerian government officials, a CBN and businesses. They rubbed minds on plugging into Nigeria's growing economy with promises of returns.
There must be a pathway of providing energy sufficiency and inclusion as we move forward.
Pitches came from Nigerian government ministers determined to present investment opportunities in the country as enticingly as possible. One of them was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyema, who played up valuable indices that assures return on investment.
Nigeria's healthcare infrastructure, making Nigeria a healthcare hub for Africa, and of course we've seen the lacuna in the vaccine production field, and hoping that Nigeria, a huge market, 1/5 of the continent, can become also a hub for vaccine manufacture in the country.
The Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, acknowledged that just like other countries in the world, Nigeria's economy is going through challenges, one of them being the COVID-19 pandemic. But she says the economy has improved.
The economic situation has improved with successive recoveries now up to 7 quarters. In the last quarter, 2022, we have reported an economic growth of 3.54% in real terms. This is compared to 3.11% in Q1 2022.
Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Bank of Industry, Mr. Olukayode Piton, spoke about how the bank has helped pull people out of poverty.
We are able to raise money internationally. In the last 5 years, we have been active raising money internationally. We've raised about $5 billion. We also focus on the MSMEs.
Amidst the plenary and breakout sessions, the Group CEO of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, Mr. Mele Kyari, talks about leveraging on the enormous gas resources in the country despite the challenges to the sector.
There's a huge challenge around oil theft in our country. Clearly a security issue. It's not beyond containment, as the Honourable Minister has also mentioned, and there's so much that our government security agencies are doing. We are collaborating with our partners and stakeholders, and that's coming down very, very drastically. But it also needs international collaboration to come to close on this. What we need here is the cooperation of buyers anywhere in the world. Today we have created a portal where any purchase of Nigerian crude anywhere in the world can be validated. We'll confirm that it is genuine, because there's no transaction in this industry that doesn't pass through the banking system. And I'm happy that I'm seeing a number of bankers here that there's no way you can sell crude oil anywhere in the world without passing the banking system.
In the end, a number of MOUs are signed and partners leave the forum hopeful about the future of Africa's biggest economy.
In other developments, Russian President Vladimir Putin incurred the wrath of the international community when he ordered a referendum in 4 Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine to join Russia as quickly as possible. Leaders condemned the action, and the EU proposed its 8th package of international sanctions against Russia.
Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't in the good books of some members of the international community after he ordered referenda in 4 regions of Ukraine and claimed they voted in favor of annexation by Russia. On Friday, he declared their formal annexation by penning his signature on documents to that effect. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned that if Russia went ahead with its plans of annexing the regions of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine, it will mark a dangerous escalation that would jeopardize the prospects for peace in the region.
The position of the United Nations is unequivocal. We are fully committed to the sovereignty, unity, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions. I want to underscore that the so-called referenda in the occupied regions were conducted during active armed conflict in areas under Russian occupation and outside Ukraine's legal and constitutional framework. They cannot be called a genuine expression of the popular will. Any decision by Russia to go forward will further jeopardize the prospects for peace.
The move, one of legal steps Russia says will lead to formal annexation of 15% of Ukraine's territory, confirms that President Putin is pressing ahead with his war against Ukraine despite suffering a major military reversal in September. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia could avoid the most damaging consequences of its war against Kyiv, but to do so, President Putin has to be stopped. In an evening address, President Zelensky says Russia will not be able to successfully annex 4 Ukrainian regions. U.S. President Joe Biden has promised the United States will never recognize Russia's claims on Ukraine's sovereign territory. President Biden is also working with allies on sanctions to impose on the annexation of new areas of Ukraine.
He can't seize his neighbor's territory and get away with it. It's simple as that. And they're going to stay the course. They're going to continue to provide military equipment so that Ukraine can defend itself and its territory and its freedom, including additional resources that the Congress is going to give me today of $13 billion more to help the Ukrainians defend themselves and fight back.
The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on Wednesday proposed a new package of Russia sanctions designed to make the Kremlin pay for escalating the conflict in Ukraine with what she calls sham votes in occupied territory.
We propose sweeping new import bans on Russian products. This will keep Russian products out of the European market and deprive Russia of an additional 7 billion euros in revenues. We're also proposing to extend the list of products that cannot be exported to Russia anymore. The aim is here to deprive the Kremlin's military complex of key technologies.
In the meantime, Russia's defense ministry says newly mobilized recruits from Russia's Rostov region are undergoing military training. They've shown their newly assigned weapons as well as being put through their paces in training on maneuvering and handling of weapons during battlefield operations. On the other hand, Russians continue to flee the homeland through the border with Georgia in an attempt to escape from the mobilization announced by President Vladimir Putin.
Joining me now is Professor of Political Science and expert on Russian affairs, Professor Glenn Dissen. He's in Oslo in Norway. Professor Dissen, thank you so much for joining me on the program.
My pleasure.
And let's talk about the events that have happened already this week and the condemnation surrounding the referendum, the so-called referendum that took place in 4 Ukrainian regions occupied by Russia, wanting to join Russia, the annexation, which could be announced either the end of this week. What are your thoughts on that? First of all, Russia's move and the West's reaction.
This is obviously an escalation, and I see it as part of it being an ongoing escalation, which has continued at least for the past 8 years. Because, from the Russian perspective, after the West helped to topple the government in Ukraine in 2014 to install a more pro-West, anti-Russian government, this unleashed a civil war in Donbass. We had this peace agreement in 2015. It wasn't implemented, and the U.S. very openly sabotaging it for 8 years, and then it escalated with Russia invading Ukraine, and the West has gradually been escalating as well by supplying heavier and heavier weapons, and of course not just weapons, but the U.S. providing intelligence, more or less taking credit for this huge offensive now in Kharkov as well for directing it. Some officials have taken credit for sinking the Moscow warship. So there's been this gradual escalation, and now Russia has escalated on its part, which by recognizing, soon to recognize these 4 territories as being Russian territory. Now, once these are recognized as Russian territory, it is a huge escalation, because this implies that any attacks on these regions now will be considered an attack on the Russian Federation, and any Western support for Ukraine with weapon and intelligence to attack these regions, it will consider to be a direct attack on the Russian Federation. So for this reason, the Russians have mobilized 300,000 men, moving them in, and effectively giving this very stern warning to the West. So it's a huge step in this gradual escalation, which we have been seeing for over the past years.
Yeah, and I know that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has called on European partners to stand up against Russia. The U.S. says it's bringing a resolution against Russia, condemning, the referendum to the Security Council. But the UN Security Council also has Russia there as a veto power. This really doesn't look like anything serious could take place, or a proper reaction for what Russia has done.
No, so the Western countries, the NATO countries, will not recognize this referendum. However, there's very little they can do at the UN Security Council, given that not just Russia, but also China are veto powers at the UN Security Council as permanent members. So it's more for drumming up international support against Russia, I think. But this question it does touch on international law, because international law is quite specific in terms of the territorial integrity of states. You can't just take territory from states. However, what the West we don't like to admit is that we have been probably the main actor, the NATO countries, to undermine this principle of territorial integrity, because in the 90s we introduced a competing principle, which is the principle of self-determination, that is for people to be allowed to break away from a country if the population want to do so. And we saw that in Kosovo when NATO first invaded Yugoslavia, then broke off Kosovo, saying that this was self-determination, that it went above or trumped territorial integrity. So, and of course, ever since then, some NATO countries at least, have been pushing a little bit, covertly, for the secession of Taiwan, but also randomly discussing breaking up Iraq or breaking up Syria. And of course annexing the Golan Heights from Syria, which Israel has taken. So we haven't been very consistent on this principle of territorial integrity. And this is where the Russians are now coming in and saying that they can play this game too. So it is it's according to United Nations, international law, this is not legal. But again, the waters have become a bit murky over the years, partly due to NATO's own actions.
So you do blame NATO for the war in Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine did want to join NATO at some point, which in turn led to Russia's invasion of the country.
Well, I wouldn't want to put it to completely black or white, saying this is all NATO's fault. Obviously, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. That was their choice and their responsibility. But to suggest that it was unprovoked, I also do not agree with, because obviously NATO has been expanding towards Russian borders for quite some time, and obviously provoked in a huge way. So, and also. It hasn't. What NATO has done has certainly not been consistent with democracy, as well as we've seen over the past 8 years.
And then the other countries within NATO, the US and the UK, who are supplying, and Germany, of course, who are supplying weapons to Ukraine, have been also accused of fighting a proxy war. How more serious could this get between these countries and what's going on with Russia and Ukraine? Because Russia is blaming these countries for the prolongation of this war, saying that they have to stop providing Ukraine with weapons, they have to stop interfering in this war. He threatened at the beginning of the war that those who interfere will also taste his wrath.
Yeah, well, it's because Russia considers this to be a proxy war, and well, this has many reasons. First of all, because the West first supported toppling the democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2014. Thereafter, the West gave its support to the new government they helped install in Kyiv to launch what they called an anti-terrorist operation against the Eastern Ukrainians, which are the one that Russia claims to support now. And ever since this, the US has been leading the sabotage of the peace agreement. And one has to also remember, when Zelensky was elected in 2019, he actually ran on the peace platform. He said he was going to talk to Eastern Ukraine. He was going to make peace with Russia. He was going to implement the peace agreement. But the United States and the right-wing nationalists, which they had armed, trained, and empowered in Ukraine, effectively laid down a veto, very openly threatening Zelensky not to implement it. So the Russians see this as being very much a conflict directed by the United States. And one also have to remember that in the beginning of the war, Russia, sent its troops to the outskirts of Kyiv, and they were close to a peace agreement. This is recognized by US officials as well. However, the Russians demanded that Ukraine would not join NATO, and if they did so, Russia would pull back to where it was before the war. But at this point in time, the British came in, Boris Johnson, and the reports suggest that he pressured Ukraine into abandoning the peace talks with Russia, and Ukraine did so in return for getting all the weapons they would want. So this is so they see this as being a NATO proxy war against Russia, and using Ukraine as an instrument to go after Russia. So it is two very different narratives that we have in NATO versus the one they have in Russia.
Yes, and I see that, China is supporting Russia in this. They're providing diplomatic support, so they said. The Chinese ambassador to the UN did say that the resolution that the US is planning to bring up in the Security Council will be would be a dead end. Some have said that, China has some stake in this. I mean, they're watching, what's going on with the war, because they also have interest in doing the same thing in Taiwan. But do you think China is doing this for another interest, perhaps?
Well, Russia and China have become engaged in a very important strategic partnership. So I don't see any probable scenario where China would turn against Russia. But still, I don't think it's accurate to say that China supports Russia in this, because they haven't given the support to the invasion. They will not recognize, they haven't recognized the Crimea as Russian, and they won't recognize these territories either. China's official position, however, is that, well, they won't supply weapons either into this war to Russia. At least none has been reported so far. But their main point is that they want peace in Ukraine, but they recognize that NATO has provoked Russia for years, leading to this war. And they also see what the Russians are saying, which is that the United States see the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to bleed Russia, bleed it of soldiers as well as resources. So China says it will not get involved, and it's calling for diplomacy because China's also quite worried that in the West there's essentially no diplomacy. We're taking the steps towards nuclear war, and there's effectively no diplomacy at all. No one's sitting down, no one wants to talk. We just had a meeting at the UN. Western diplomats did their best to avoid the Russians because they want to, well, quote unquote, isolate them. So this is a very dangerous path, and the Chinese kind of have taken this lead in saying we need diplomatic solutions, we need to sit down. But I wouldn't say that's the same as aligning with Russia. But obviously, that being said, Russia and China face many of the same threats. They have many of the same interests. So in the strategic partnership, yeah, China definitely wouldn't turn against Russia.
So we've seen Russia use chemical weapons on Ukrainian territories, and now President Putin is promising, vowing again, that he will go all out with nuclear weapons. You think he'll do it for real?
Well, I'm not sure when Russia used chemical weapons in Ukraine, but also I don't have any reports on this, but also the reports on using nuclear weapons, I think they're quite exaggerated as well. He warned that Russia can use nuclear weapons in two scenarios. That is, if it's attacked with nuclear weapons, but also if the existence of the state is threatened with conventional weapons. So this is similar to the policy that NATO had during the Cold War. Now, the argument effectively is if the West attempts to defeat Russia on the battlefield and would succeed to the extent that the Russians would be losing the war and the state would be threatened, then their argument is, yes, we would use nuclear weapons. And again, one shouldn't take too lightly on these warnings, because keep in mind that, well, for example, even in 2014, nobody in Russia was laying claim to Crimea, but after 2014, when the government was toppled, they took Crimea, even though they knew this could lead to a nuclear war. Now, why would they do this? Well, as American ambassadors and CIA directors have recognized for the past 25 years, Russia considers NATO in Ukraine to be an existential threat. So Russia's effectively looking down the road and seeing where this is going. There's no diplomacy. There's continuous escalation. The West doesn't want to talk to Russia. Instead, they're saying that Russia will be defeated on the battlefield. The argument is effectively this can't happen. So you will see nuclear weapons, I guess, raining over European cities long before you will see NATO marching through Crimea. So this is a warning about trying to defeat and crush the Russian state. But I wouldn't say that it's the same as threatening to launch an immediate nuclear attack, which would be a very different argument to make.
Finally, what do you think Ukraine can do to end this war?
Well, the situation for the Ukrainians are quite horrible. They lost a lot of men, a lot of soldiers. They've also been losing territory. Ideally, they would have reached a settlement early on, I guess, because before 2014, all the Russians wanted was a Ukraine that was neutral, not joining NATO. After 2014, they wanted Donbas to have autonomy, but still be a part of Ukraine. But they didn't get this either. So after 2022, now we see that they declared independence for Donbas. But given the West continued to pour weapons into this, they're now recognizing 4 regions of Ukraine, not only as independent, but becoming part of the Russian Federation. So this continues to escalate, and I think Ukraine will lose more and more. So I think it's quite a hard and terrible situation for Ukraine, because they don't have any good options. Ideally, the best thing to do would be if NATO, they have something to negotiate with. If instead of making Ukraine bear all the cost, NATO could approach Moscow and promise, for example, we will offer no more NATO expansion. This is an end to this expansionist policies of NATO if you pull back from Ukraine. I think this will be a very powerful negotiation card. However, of course, no one in Washington is interested to use this card. Instead, I think we're going to see things go from bad to worse for Ukraine. So again, it's a very horrible situation for the Ukrainians.
Indeed it is. Professor Glenn Dyson, thank you so much for speaking with me on Diplomatic Channel. This is where we end the program this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani, and thank you for the pleasure of your time.